Human.
Why do we get angry? There is an anger of angels and an anger of devils. Which one should we listen to?
We leven in een tijd waarin woede de boventoon voert, stelt econoom Eric Lonergan. Als we goed kiezen, kunnen we die boosheid gebruiken om vooruit te komen.
Why do people get angry? What does it say about our politics when people are getting angry? I grew up in Dublin, in Ireland, and I can remember to this day when Nelson Mandela visited Ireland. In fact, it was one of the first countries that he visited after he was released from prison in 1990. You may be wondering why on earth did he visit Ireland? I haven't heard a good reason as to why he did. I think there was a pretty strong anti-apartheid movement in Ireland, which is a very small country. But I remember very vividly as a teenager going into the centre of Dublin to listen to this extraordinary man delivering a speech in the year of the liberation of South Africa. Those of you who have heard or seen footage of Nelson Mandela, he was an extraordinarily calm individual. He had extraordinary moral authority. And he was talking to these huge crowds in the centre of Dublin. And I have two abiding memories of that day. The first memory is that extraordinary social and economic change is actually possible. Because despite a struggle that had lasted for decades, once apartheid actually collapsed in South Africa, it happened very, very rapidly. That's my first memory, which is really one of hope about social and economic change. Now, the second memory from that day is a very mundane and somewhat odd memory, which is in the corner of my eye whilst I listened to this great man speak. There was an angry Irish man waving an Irish flag, and he kept on shouting angrily, interrupting this great historic occasion. And eventually, I capitulated and looked him in the eye, and he said to me, "What about the oppressed people of Ireland? What about us?" And he had this visceral anger in his face. And I remember as a teenager thinking to myself, today isn't about us. It's actually about something bigger than us. Now that memory returned to me in very, very different circumstances, almost 20 years later. When I was in Florida, in fact, I was in Miami in the United States. And this was just after the global financial crisis. And I was sitting in a taxi driver. I was over there on a business trip. And I struck up a conversation with the taxi driver. I would say he was a man maybe in his mid to late 60s, early 70s. And he told me that he'd moved from Boston. Funnily enough, he was an Irish American, but he'd been born in the United States. And he'd migrated from Boston to Florida for his retirement. Now, I didn't say anything to him. I just thought it was a bit odd if he was retiring. Why was he working as a cab driver? And he was a very, very lovely man, and we had a very interesting conversation. At one point, he said to me, "You're probably wondering, given that I came here to retire, why am I still working as a taxi driver?" And I said, well, I didn't want to pry, but it did cross my mind. He said, well, about 3 years ago, my daughter was diagnosed with a very, very serious heart condition. And in fact, the only surgeon who could treat her was one of a world-renowned cardiologist who actually works for the Miami Dolphins. So he said, unfortunately, I had to pay for the treatment. And as a result, I've got around $1 million of debt, which I am now working to repay. Obviously, as a European, that strikes a chord with one at a human level. But what was interesting is, as the conversation continued and we were listening to the radio, this very decent, calm human being started to get very angry. Now, what was the source of his anger? You may remember there was a period during the financial crisis where a number of individuals at an American insurance company called AIG, which was actually one of the largest companies that kind of brought the financial system down, had to be bailed out by the taxpayer. And a number of their employees were trying to sue the federal government to get their bonuses of millions of dollars. Now this man, this very calm, decent man, was getting very, very angry about this because he'd paid all of his taxes. He had the right to be aggrieved that he was paying for his daughter's care, but he thought that was his moral duty. He was going to do that. But he really, really objected to the fact that his tax dollars had bailed out a financial firm, and these people who should have ended up in prison were trying to walk away with millions of dollars. Now, this is when I thought about the angry Irishman waving a flag at the speech Nelson Mandela is giving. These are two types of anger, or are they? What are these angers telling me? So when I was writing a book called Angrynomics with a political economist called Mark Blythe from the United States, we followed up on this theme of anger. We wanted to try and understand why there is anger in our politics. And we started by doing a data search. And IBM has this system called Watson Analytics, and you can scan hundreds of thousands of stories, news stories. And we sorted all of the stories by the theme of anger. And there were two really, really interesting results which relate to these two stories. The first most frequent citation of anger in news stories relates to something that's best described as moral outrage. It's our sense of an injustice occurring. I like to think of this as the anger of angels. And in fact, if you read moral philosophy, Aristotle, this is the type of anger that Aristotle talks about. Aristotle talks about anger as an appropriate response to a perceived injustice. So when we see something that is patently wrong and unjust, anger is one of our reactions. It's almost like our moral compass. Now, interestingly, a year ago or so when the book was published, you may remember there was the Black Lives Matter movement was all over the televisions, and in the United States there were lots of protests. And a very interesting video went viral, which was Cornel West, who's one of the kind of intellectual forefathers of the civil rights movement, and he was interviewed on CNN. And he gave a very, very interesting argument, which I just want to run by you, which is what he said was, what would it say about our society if we witnessed police brutality? In other words, if we witnessed the police breaking the law, what would it say about us if we didn't get angry? Now, actually, that's Aristotle's idea about anger, which is you should get anger. There's an appropriate anger when we perceive an injustice. Now, that was the first type of anger that came up in this big data search, which is a kind of moral outrage, a sense of wrongdoing. The second type, though, is really intriguing. And this may relate to the Irish nationalist waving a flag, which is the second most frequent type of news story about anger, was angry sports fans. Now, immediately you think, if you go to sporting events, you're probably thinking, I mean, particularly if you go to really intense sporting events. You know, I like to go to football games in North London where there is intense rivalry and there's an amazing atmosphere. Now, if you go to sporting events like that, you would say you didn't need to do a big data search, okay? I could have told you that there are angry fans. And they're a particular type. They're usually a minority. And I think I've never seen an angry fan that wasn't a man, right? So men pay money to go to sporting events to get really angry, right? And you can even see the same guy every week getting angry. Now, that's a really interesting phenomenon. So I got thinking to myself, why? What's the function? I'm an economist by training. So I go to football matches and I try to work out, why are they doing that? Right? I'm looking at these fans. Why are they behaving? How does that fit into the economic system? And I ended up concluding that there are two faces to anger, right? We have the anger of angels, which is our moral compass. And we have the anger of devils, which is actually a tribal energy. We have an evolved instinct to defend the tribe. And when there's scarcity, when we feel we're under threat and we need to go to war, we all need to turn a given color. And if you look at the literature in social psychology, our propensity to form groups is so profound and so subtle, it's virtually impossible to resist. whether it's liberal or conservative, left-wing, right-wing, yellow, red, whether it's a Dutch fan or an Irish fan, right? We will imperceptibly, we will very, very quickly form groups. And when we feel under threat, the power of the group is even more important. So we have these two types of anger. How do they relate to our politics? Well, what we need to remember about our politicians is they are primarily motivated by getting elected. Now, if you look at research in political science, it's very revealing. Angry people are more likely to vote. So if I need to get elected, angry people are more likely to vote, and elections are increasingly won by very, very small numbers of people. Right? You just swing a margin in an electorate. 2 or 3% you often win an election with. You know, Donald Trump won the presidential election in 2016 by changing the votes of 70,000 Americans, just 70,000. That's less than 1% of the electorate. So what is my strategy? Make people angry. And how do I make people angry? I have two options, either moral outrage or tribal rage. So I think in our politics today, there's a fork in our road. We can go one of two ways. We can fall for the anger of devils, or we need to listen to the anger of angels. Now, what are the angels saying? And do we agree with them? Well, I have a hunch that Greta Thunberg is actually an angry angel. And as an economist, I think she's right. So what we need to do is create a politics which requires new economic institutions to make our planet sustainable. Now, the interesting question is, as an economist, we have the financial resources. You know, I did something very dull before coming over to the Netherlands to talk with you all, and I looked at what the interest rate is on a 10-year government bond in the Netherlands. And actually, up to 7 years, the interest rate on government debt in the Netherlands is negative. Right? The Dutch state gets paid money to borrow. Now, the problem of climate change is essentially one of investment spending. Right? So what the Netherlands and Ireland and every other country in the world needs to do is replace all of our energy infrastructure with sustainable electricity and then fuel everything off electricity. That's an investment problem as an economist. We have the financial resources. We have the technology. Right? This would not result in a dramatic change in our lives. This would be a dramatic change in our economies. So why isn't it happening? Well, perhaps we need a little more of the right kind of anger. Thank you.
Meer brainwash? Meer verrassende ideeën? Ga dan nu naar brainwash.nl.
Human.